C.S. Lewis has been called one of the most creative minds of the 20th century. More than 40 years after his death, Lewis's scholarly works are still used in university classrooms, while his children's books, The Chronicles of Narnia, are loved by families around the world. Books such as Mere Christianity and The Problem of Pain have been life-changing for multiplied thousands who consider Lewis a spiritual mentor and guide. But just who was C.S. Lewis? What events shaped his life? And how did he change from an outspoken opponent of Christianity to one of its most powerful defenders? Join us for The Making of a Mind, the life of C.S. Lewis, on this day of discovery.
Perhaps it was the land that first kindled the imagination of a boy. A boy who would one day become a writer of stories about an enchanted land. A land where courageous children confront evil and prevail through the power of a great lion and the deepest magic of all. Perhaps it all began with the land.
The geography and the landscape of Ireland are intimately linked in Lewis's imagination. He comes back to them again and again. The geography of Ireland and of Ulster in particular is very intimate. The hills are manageable. The scenery is full of, everywhere you look, there's practically some sort of link to a mythological event.
He particularly loved the area in the Mourne Mountains, which we've already talked about, and the area around Donegal with the wildness and the vast expanse of sky and sea and sand. And he also loved the north coast.
Clive Staples Lewis entered this world in Belfast, Northern Ireland, on November the 29th, 1898. He and his brother Warren, who was 3 years older, were born into a family that loved books and ideas. Their father Albert, a solicitor, read books voraciously, and the house overflowed with volumes ranging from Paradise Lost to E. Nesbit's children's fantasies. The boy's mother, Flora, held a degree in mathematics from Queen's University Belfast, an unusual attainment for a woman of her time.
Women were only really starting to go to university and being educated then. It wasn't an everyday thing. Now everybody goes to university. The degrees aren't worth an awful lot. I mean, those days, for her to have gone to university and get a degree, that was quite an achievement.
While Albert devoted himself to his work as an attorney, Flora cared for her 2 sons, supervised the servants, and took part in the community life of upper middle-class society. Every Sunday, the family attended St. Mark's Church of Ireland, where Flora's father, the Reverend Thomas Hamilton, had been the first rector.
It obviously had a big influence on his early upbringing, Christian life. It was a grounding on his religious upbringing.
Early on, it was evident that C.S. Lewis had a mind of his own. At the age of 4, he announced that he did not like the name Clive and wanted to be known as Jaxie. From then on, his family and friends called him Jax, or simply Jack.
They had a very contented childhood. The family moved originally from Dundela Villas when they were both young to the bigger house at Little Lee, which that would be situated in East Belfast. And the move to the big house was a definite move also up in the social hierarchy. This was seen as an advancement. You were moving from the suburbs to a more affluent area, and this class-conscious considerations mattered in Belfast as they do elsewhere. This was a great growing city. You had the shipyards dominating the Belfast skyline, Harland and Wolff, where the Titanic was built, of course, everyone would be aware of that. Basically a thriving industrial centre at the turn of the century. Lewis describes the lying in bed and listening to the clang and hammer of the shipyard. So it's that busy port, thriving, and the noise and the clatter and the bustle, and very prosperous, very a city on the move, as it were.
We had a photograph, very poor photograph, of the Titanic going down the loch on our first voyage. You could certainly hear the shipyards working. And I mean, even I can remember that. And wartime years, that tap, tap, tap of the riveters. From little Lee, certainly they'd have heard the riveting sounds from the shipyard. I mean, Jack had said that in one of his books. Yes, they would have seen the loch too, through the trees, from upstairs.
But you go away from Little Lee, round a few corners, and up an area called Craigantlett, right into the Hollywood Hills. And he, with his brother Warnie, used to take his bicycle and head up into these hills and cycle up in the summertime on holidays, just looking around as guys do, young boys do. And when you go up there, and he describes it in Surprised by Joy, you have a tremendous vista of Northern Ireland. There's a place you can be up there, overlooking Hollywood and overlooking East Belfast, where you can see up north, up to the Antrim Hills, the Antrim Plateau, and you can see south right down to the mountains of Mourne and that area. That sort of romantic sense of longing, that sense of feeling for joy, that sense of looking beyond, was starting even when he was really a young child. And there are those who say, and I think they're right, that the geography or the topography of Northern Ireland is part of the geography of Narnia.
As young boys, Jack and Warnie drew pictures and wrote stories about their own imaginary worlds. Warnie called his India, while Jack created Animal Land. Eventually they merged them into the make-believe world of Boxen. When Warnie went away to boarding school, Jack missed his brother, but enjoyed the solitude of his space in the attic called the Little End Room. Then the boys would be together again for the school holidays, and a month at the sea in Castle Rock with their mother.
Albert Lewis, of course, was a Belfast solicitor. Very, very busy schedule, ran his own office in the centre of Belfast. And he viewed these visits to the seaside as a sort of penitential, something that he had to do for the sake of the family. And Albert Lewis was the breadwinner of the family, and that's how he viewed it, this whole Protestant work ethic, which was how Belfast was built at that time and how it was part of his mindset. The idea of taking a month off to lounge about on a beach was just totally alien to him. It just he couldn't consider it. Plus, he was the police court solicitor, so he had work there that had to be carried out, and he was reluctant to hand that over to anyone else.
But everything changed for the Lewis family when Flora became seriously ill. Little Lee became like a hospital, with doctors and nurses speaking in hushed tones, and Albert often in tears. Flora suffered through 2 operations for cancer, was better for a time, then died in great pain on August 23, 1908. Warnie was 12, and Jack was 9.
Of course, with the death of Lewis's mother, things changed, attitudes changed, and well, Jack's life changed then, because he was, shortly after that, 2 weeks after his mother's death, he was sent away to boarding school in England. And I mean, it's hard to fathom now the effect that had on him.
Jack and Warnie crossed the Irish Sea by ferry on the first leg of their journey to the town of Watford, 30 miles northwest of London. Years later, C.S. Lewis wrote in his autobiography, "With my mother's death, all settled happiness, all that was tranquil and reliable, disappeared from my life. There was to be much fun, many pleasures, many stabs of joy, but no more of the old security. It was sea and islands now. The great continent had sunk like Atlantis.
I think when Flora Lewis died, the boys not only lost their mother, they lost the father, in the sense that Albert couldn't cope on his own at that point. Hence the decision to send Jack to boarding school in England. Perhaps he thought that being close to Warnie would somehow be the best option at that point. Perhaps he thought he would make a man of him, as it were. I'm not sure, but the decision was certainly catastrophic to a boy at that age.
For the next 2 years, Jack endured the academic monotony and the harsh punishments of Wynyard School under its brutal headmaster, the Reverend Robert Capron. The boys nicknamed the headmaster Oldie, and his grown son who assisted him, Wee Wee. Few boys escaped the headmaster's cruelty, and all lived in fear of his cane. Warnie left Wynyard in 1909, and Jack escaped a year later when the school closed. Shortly afterward, the headmaster was declared insane. During school holidays, Jack and Warnie returned home to Belfast. While Albert was away at work, they entertained themselves by reading, walking, and talking as best friends. They also stole their father's cigarettes and smoked them secretly. One civilizing element for the boys was the hospitality and care of their relatives, the Hewitt family who lived at the estate of Glenmachan, near Little Lee. Jack was especially fond of their youngest daughters, Kay and Gundred, 10 years older than he.
My mother was born Gundred, or Gundrida really, Hewitt. Her mother and Lewis's mother, Flora, were cousins. She was about 6 foot tall, with rich red hair, elegant. If I quoted Jack Lewis, the most beautiful woman he ever saw, she certainly was very attractive. And her photographs in early life are very lovely. At the time after Flora had died, my grandmother took over looking after him and, filling in the gap of a mother, which really meant that a lot of it was Mum and Kay. They weren't always awfully fond of him. I remember somebody visiting one time and saying, "Well, what did you think of him? How did you think of him?" She just came straight out, "Oh, he was a cheeky little brat." Cheeky little brat? How could anybody say that about Jack Lewis? But she said, "No, he's a cheeky little brat." He was, according to what she always told me, he was very bumptious, full of himself. And, yeah, cheeky.
After beginning a term at Campbell College in Belfast, Jack became so ill that Albert brought his son home for rest and recuperation. Lewis savoured his 2-month reprieve from school by reading scores of books, mostly fantasy and fairy tales. From there, he entered Cherbourg Preparatory School in Malvern, England, just up the hill from Warnie, who was at Malvern College. At Cherbourg, Jack found a solid educational setting with capable teachers. But while his academic skill increased, his childhood religious belief began to wane. Through his own intellectual doubts and the subtle influence of those around him, Lewis experienced what he called a loss of faith, virtue, and simplicity. Of that time, he said simply, "I ceased to be a Christian."
Lewis had grown up in a Christian home, but he still, he had turned away. He was relieved. He thought of God as the great interferer. He didn't want someone to tell him what to do, someone to order his life. He wanted freedom, and when he was able to convince himself that God didn't exist, there was just relief.
When Lewis first saw a copy of the book Siegfried and the Twilight of the Gods, with its vivid illustrations, it rekindled his childhood search for what he called joy, the longing for something far beyond happiness or pleasure. Jack's new interest in Norse mythology led him to the sweeping music of Richard Wagner, which captivated him with a feeling of northernness, far distances, and a world of imagination. Arthur Greaves, a Belfast neighbour, shared Jack's interest in mythology. Their lifelong friendship and correspondence helped Jack through many dark and discouraging days. During these years, C.S. Lewis occupied two worlds. In one, he worked hard at his studies, excelling in Latin and English, while taking part in school activities. In the other, he escaped to a place of imagination and heroic tales. But part of the continuing reality he and Warnie shared was the strained relationship with their father.
Jack's relationship with his father was very tense. Having said that, Albert Lewis supported his son financially throughout his studies. And Lewis did appreciate that. And after his father had died, Lewis had said, I think it was to Owen Barfield, that one of these major regrets was that he didn't treat his father better. He resented his father in many ways. He resented the domineering aspects of his father and so on, but possibly behind that is Albert Lewis's decision to send his son away to boarding school at such a young age. I think the letters between father and son they maintain a certain standard of what is expected in that relationship. But if you look at Jack's letters to, for instance, Arthur Greaves or to his brother Warnie, I mean, they continually poke fun at Albert and can be quite malicious in many respects. I mean, they call him the potato bird and so on, and the OAB, which is their abbreviated term for the old air balloon.
In 1913, Jack won a classical scholarship to Malvern College. Warnie enjoyed his years at Malvern and called it a paradise, but Jack quickly became unhappy there. Although he loved the beauty of the school and admired his English teacher, C.S. Lewis couldn't stand the system that valued athletes over scholars and forced everyone to play sports. Lewis suffered from a deformity of his thumbs, clumsiness of the hands, as he called it. He couldn't throw a ball or swing a bat, and disliked taking part in games or being required to cheer for those who did. He was appalled at the practice known as fagging, that allowed upperclassmen to use the younger boys virtually as slaves, to perform menial tasks for them. Often Lewis was called to clean someone's boots during the only time he had for preparation before morning classes. Jack just wanted to read and study and learn. At Malvern College, the Grundy Library became his sanctuary, from sports and servitude. Once inside, he could relax, and his mind could roam free. After a year, Jack's father agreed that his younger son simply wasn't suited for any public school. Albert sent him to be privately tutored by his own former headmaster, William Kirkpatrick, affectionately known as the Great Knock. C.S. Lewis arrived at Kirkpatrick's home in Great Bookham, Surrey, in September 1914, a month after the outbreak of World War I. Warnie, already commissioned in the army, was awaiting orders to the Western Front in France.
I think we can never get to the bottom of just how much Lewis was influenced by Mr. Kirkpatrick, his tutor, who really taught Lewis to think. Lewis said that when he arrived in Great Bookham in Surrey to begin being tutored by Mr. Kirkpatrick for Oxford, he ventured an opinion about what Surrey looked like, and Mr. Kirkpatrick pointed out that as he'd never been in Surrey before, and he didn't know what it was like, he wasn't entitled to an opinion.
What Kirkpatrick did for him and to him was to subject him to rigorous criticism about logical processes, so that he was not able to claim any particular point without having to justify it by having a reason for it. And in a way, the Great Knock, as he was called, W.T. Kirkpatrick, was the one who strengthened the rationality of Lewis, because up to this point, of course, in the early Lewis, the young Lewis, he was fascinated by story, he was fascinated by myths, he wrote stories, he lived in the world of books and imagination. He had this openness to culture, but Kirkpatrick gave it discipline and direction.
Each day began with a traditional Irish breakfast of bacon, eggs and soda bread prepared by Mrs. Kirkpatrick. Private study and sessions with a great knock followed. They began by reading the Iliad in Greek and ranged through other classics in Latin, Italian, and German. In a letter to Albert Lewis, William Kirkpatrick said of Jack, "I never had any pupil who could bear the strain as he can, and as time goes on he makes it more severe. I admire his perseverance, industry, and determination. As I told you, I have to insist on his stopping work at 11 p.m.
Kirkpatrick was very, very important in his development, although Kirkpatrick was someone he also had to recover from the faith point of view, because Kirkpatrick was a skeptic, an unbeliever. He had started out training for the Presbyterian ministry, but he effectively lost his faith. And although he didn't influence Lewis negatively by trying to deprive him of his faith, the kind of precepts intellectually and logically he would have given Lewis would have reinforced him in the faith that he had already lost.
Although Lewis had recently been confirmed at St. Mark's Church to please his father, he considered himself an atheist. He wrote to Arthur Greaves, "I believe in no religion. There is absolutely no proof for any of them. And from a philosophical standpoint, Christianity is not even the best. All religions, that is, all mythologies, to give them their proper name, are merely man's own invention." Years later, Lewis would say, in reflection, "A young man who wishes to remain a sound atheist cannot be too careful of his reading. There are traps everywhere." And Lewis was about to step in one, laid many years before by the Scottish preacher and writer George MacDonald.
C.S. Lewis first began to read George MacDonald when he was a teenager. He was at that time studying with Kirkpatrick, the man who had such a huge impact on him in so many ways. And Lewis was on a train platform and always was looking for books and found an Everyman's edition of Phantastes. Picked it up, and he said he had no idea what he was letting himself in for. He began to read, and he said it wasn't until years later he realized what attracted him. But he said it was this, it was the sense of holiness, just drifting throughout those books, blowing throughout them. And he was captivated, obviously, and he read and continued to read MacDonald, and this was before he'd become a Christian.
And he said that reading that book was like crossing a frontier. He said his imagination had been baptized by reading that book. The rest of me, he said, not unnaturally took a little bit longer.
And so from there, MacDonald, as well as other authors, began to have this touch on his heart that awakened him to the fact that God did exist, and that there was something very compelling and something beautiful, and what he'd always longed for was, in fact, what he was finding was God.
At the end of 1916, Jack was accepted into Oxford University. But having reached the age of military service, the war raging in Europe lay between him and the studies he longed to pursue. Lewis said of himself at this time, "Christianity was mainly associated for me with ugly architecture, ugly music, and bad poetry. But of course what mattered most of all was my deep-seated hatred of authority, my monstrous individualism, my lawlessness. No word in my vocabulary expressed deeper hatred than the word interference. But Christianity placed at the center what then seemed to me a transcendental interferer. There was no region, even in the innermost depths of one's soul, which one could surround with a barbed wire fence and guard with a notice, 'No admittance.' And that was what I wanted, some area, however small, of which I could say to all other beings, 'This is my business, and mine only.'"
Lewis had his own struggles. They were very great. And we ought to remember, Lewis often pointed this out, he was not a man who just sort of drifted into Christianity when he was a young man and just sort of grew in it. Lewis had resisted the faith for many years. He thought he had decided the matters of the universe, and it was more or less settled. but God wouldn't leave him alone.
In 1916, C.S. Lewis did not consider himself a Christian and had no intention of becoming one. But this was only one chapter in his life, and much remained to be written. Within a decade, Lewis would meet a fellow professor named J.R.R. Tolkien. Their friendship and mutual encouragement would lead them to write, among other works, The Chronicles of Narnia and The Lord of the Rings. These lines from Tolkien, unwritten in 1916, would later seem almost prophetic of what lay ahead for 18-year-old C.S. Lewis and many others like him. All that is gold does not glitter. Not all those who wander are lost. The old that is strong does not wither. Deep roots are not reached by the frost. From the ashes a fire shall be woken. A light from the shadows shall spring. Renewed shall be blade that was broken. The crownless again shall be king.
C.S. Lewis is remembered today as a gifted thinker, teacher, and writer. He authored more than 30 books, including literary criticism, defense of the Christian faith, and the beloved children's series, The Chronicles of Narnia. But many readers of his books know very little about Lewis himself and the events that shaped his life. On this program, we follow C.S. Lewis into the trenches of World War I, to Oxford University, and through a long spiritual struggle to the realization that altered the course of his life. Join us for The Reluctant Convert on this day of discovery.
Born in Belfast in 1898, Clive Staples Lewis demonstrated his lively imagination and writing skill as a child. He also asserted his independence by announcing that instead of being called Clive, he would be known as Jack. When Jack was 9, the death of his mother cast a dark, lingering shadow over life, both for him and his older brother, Warnie. After several unhappy terms in English boarding schools, 2 years of private study under William Kirkpatrick honed Jack's abilities as a logical thinker and debater, but it also deepened his doubts about the existence of God. His excitement at being admitted to Oxford University was tempered by the reality that his academic career would be interrupted and possibly ended by the war. In April 1917, half of University College had been converted to a hospital for wounded soldiers, and Lewis was one of only 8 undergraduates in residence. As an Irishman, Lewis was exempt from being conscripted into the British Army, yet he chose to volunteer. His brother Warnie had been serving in France for 2 years. During Jack's first term, he joined a cadet battalion through the Officers' Training Corps. He also developed a close friendship with Paddy Moore, a fellow Irishman whose mother and sister lived in Oxford. On many weekends, he enjoyed the hospitality of Mrs. Moore's home and developed a great liking for her. Before Jack and Paddy left Oxford, they made a pact to care for the other's parent if only one of them survived the war. Both knew that the odds of their being killed were very high. When Second Lieutenant C.S. Lewis reached the trenches of the Western Front, he was barely 19 years old. No one who knew the studious young man could quite picture him in this new situation.
depicting Lewis as an infantry lieutenant is a bit difficult. He's not the kind of person you associate with physical activity or muscular anything. He wasn't a sporty type of man. What I get more out of Lewis in the Somerset Light Infantry, as he was in 1917, 1918, is how he went through the rigours of the trenches and of that horrible conflict that took place in the northern part of France. So that at that age, which he was, 19, he really had to grow up extremely fast. And he was plunged into deep danger and suffering and extremity with virtually no preparation and very little army training. And he was also exposed for the first time to the camaraderie and the commonality of the army and dealing with all ranks, people from everywhere, from all stations in life, not just the one class, which is what he would normally have been moving in.
Sergeant Ayres, an experienced soldier whom Jack greatly admired, took the young lieutenant under his wing. They were together on April the 15th, 1918, during a German attack, when a British artillery round fell short, killing Sergeant Ayres and wounding Lewis. When Warney received the news, he commandeered a motorcycle and rode 50 miles to a field hospital where he found his brother recovering and out of danger. Within a few weeks, Jack was sent back to England to convalesce.
It brought him face to face with real life and not life in books, and the common man and common sense, if you like. Lewis, despite his great intellect and his vast reading, his knowledge of the classics of English literature, Greek and Latin literature, and world literature, and philosophy and so forth, understood ordinary people and the common man. And I guess that is particularly because he got to know them in extremity and was able to relate to them and relate to the common sense of the ordinary person.
Jack Lewis made only passing references to his experiences at the front, but the war marked him, as it did all whom it touched. In a poem titled French Nocturne, Lewis wrote, "The jaws of a sacked village, stark and grim, out on the ridge have swallowed up the sun, and in one angry streak his blood has run to left and right along the horizon dim. What call have I to dream of anything? I am a wolf. Back to the world again, and speech of fellow brutes that once were men. Our throats can bark for slaughter, cannot sing." Thousands of people in Belfast, including Jack's favourite cousins, suffered the tragic consequences of the war.
A great many ladies of Kay's mum's age never married. The men had all been killed, who they might have married. Certainly that was the way with Kay. So the war did impact on them. But Mum worked as a nurse. Kay was an ambulance driver in France and in England. So they probably saw quite a lot. My mother worked in the army hospitals. She worked in London and in a hospital in France, I think it was Rouen. And certainly that, I think, was quite traumatic at times. I wasn't aware of that until her last few weeks, when her mind was rambling a lot and she was always talking about, oh, look at that man with back off his head, or cover him up, and things like that, which obviously had preyed on her mind all that time, but she never ever talked about it. I think if you see trauma, it stays with you forever, doesn't it? Must. You can squash it down, but it's going to come back.
During the time Jack spent in hospital and convalescent homes, he kept hoping for a visit from his father. 3 months after being wounded, he wrote to his father from London. "You know I have some difficulty in talking of the greatest things. It is the fault of our generation and of the English schools. But at least you'll believe that I was never before so eager to cling to every bit of our old home life and to see you. I know I have often been far from what I should in my relations to you, and have undervalued an affection and a generosity which an experience of other people's parents has shown me in a new light. But please God, I shall do better in the future. Come and see me. I am homesick. That is the long and the short of it." But his father never came. Their relationship continued as it had, outwardly cordial, but inwardly frustrated and annoyed. Jack used his time in hospital to complete a volume of poetry called Spirits in Bondage, which was accepted for publication. It seemed that his dream of becoming a great poet might be fulfilled. In September 1918, word came that Jack's friend Paddy Moore had been killed in action. Of the 5 young cadets who had enjoyed Mrs. Moore's hospitality in Oxford, only Lewis was still alive. He had pledged to care for Paddy's mother, and he intended to keep his promise. A month after the armistice ended the war, Warnie was home for Christmas with his father at Little Lee. Warnie's diary for December the 27th records, "A red letter day today. We were sitting in the study about 11 o'clock this morning when we saw a cab coming up the avenue. It was Jack's. He had been demobilized, thank God. He's looking pretty fit. We had lunch and then all 3 went for a walk. It was as if the evil dream of 4 years had passed away, and we were still in the year 1913. The murderous guns had at last been silenced, but the world would never be the same." In January, Jack was back in Oxford, pursuing his studies. But there was now an added dimension to his life. He kept up a regular correspondence with Mrs. Moore, and within the year, she and her daughter Maureen had moved to a village near Oxford to be closer to Jack.
The beginnings of the relationship are complicated. It has to do with her son Paddy Moore and his death in World War I, and then Lewis taking on his household. It was marked by very, very great deception. Lewis is, at this stage, what he called a blaspheming atheist. And he's deceiving Albert. For those years, when Lewis is an undergraduate living with Mrs. Moore, Albert doesn't know that. Poor Albert thinks he's just supporting the latest textbook purchase, and he doesn't realize he's contributing to this household. You know. So this was probably the worst part of Lewis's life.
Lewis's relationship with Mrs. Moore, of course, is probably the most controversial relationship that he had. In Surprised by Joy, he takes one paragraph and basically says, "There's one part of my life that I'm not going to talk about," and that's the end of it. In the end, he took seriously that commitment that he made to his friend Paddy Moore. As they both went off to war, they promised the other to take care of the survivor's aged parent. Lewis took that seriously, and he cared for Mrs. Moore until in the early 1950s when she died.
I think that Mrs. Moore provided Lewis with a stable home life, something that up until that point he had never experienced before. The typical Irish breakfast would be bacon and eggs and soda bread and possibly pancakes. Lewis always talks about Irish soda bread or perhaps wheaten bread, and always mugs of tea. Mrs. Moore is, of course, an Irish woman born in County Tyrone, Pomeroy, County Tyrone. This is an Irish link. This is in every day in your daily life. This is where it matters to you in your home life. Not so much in the realms of your imagination where you go now and again, but this is in your daily life. These are people who come from the same part of the world as you, and you have a natural affinity with them. And I think people tend to overlook that, or they dismiss Mrs. Moore as being irrelevant and so on. But at the end of the day, Lewis chose to live with Mrs. Moore.
As a student, Lewis achieved the remarkable feat of receiving first-class honours in 3 major areas of study. First, honour mods, Greek and Latin texts. Then greats, classical history and philosophy. And finally, English language and literature. It was the equivalent of graduating summa cum laude while earning 3 degrees at the same time. In 1925, Lewis was elected a Fellow of Magdalen College, Oxford. Jack was delighted, and after 15 years of supporting his son's education, his father was relieved.
I'm reluctant to give a negative impression of Albert Lewis because he was a very loving man. I mean, he did love his sons, but in his own particular way. That did not manifest itself in embraces or as we now look on parenting. But he did provide Jack Lewis with the financial stability to carry out his studies. And without Albert Lewis's help, Jack Lewis would not have gone to Oxford. There's no question of that. He could not have afforded to do it. Albert Lewis picked up the bill again and again for Jack Lewis until he secured his place in Oxford.
At Magdalen College, Lewis occupied the rooms provided for him in the new building, built in 1733. At the formal evening meal, he took his place at the high table with the other faculty members in the hall. As a young don, Lewis's life followed a rigorous routine of study, lectures, and tutoring individual students. But he usually found time for a daily stroll along Addison's Walk, a beautiful wooded path running alongside the college. And when time allowed, Lewis was always ready for a swim.
Yes, he loved splashing around in the waves. He talks a lot about his body surfing in the waves of Donegal on the northwest coast of Ireland. And he would often go swimming in rivers. He liked to swim without the tiresome convention of bathing trunks. And there's a little enclosure on the river in Oxford called Parson's Pleasure, which was enclosed and set aside for the nude bathers amongst the university dons. They tried to set up a female equivalent called Dame's Delight, but the women weren't interested in doing it. They've closed it down now, Parson's Pleasure.
In September 1929, Lewis's father Albert died, just after Jack had spent a month caring for him in Belfast. Lewis cabled the news to Warney, a career officer now stationed in Shanghai. A few days later, Jack wrote to a friend, "Thank you for your sympathy. I thought I had perhaps got a bit used to people I cared for dying while I was at the front, but it doesn't seem to make much difference. He was such a very strong personality and had been the background of my life for so long that I can hardly believe it's all over." But it was over, and a door to the past had closed behind C.S. Lewis. At the same time, a new pathway into the future was beginning to unfold. In the academic world, Jack's circle of close friends grew to include Hugo Dyson and J.R.R. Tolkien, respected scholars who met Lewis on his own intellectual ground, yet stood firm in their own Christian belief.
J.R.R. Tolkien is one of Lewis's closest friends during his lifetime. They taught together at Oxford. Obviously, people are well acquainted with The Lord of the Rings, but there is an interconnection there that is very deep and very real. Their friendship was important for many reasons, not the least of which that Tolkien, as a believer before Lewis came to faith, was one of those who helped Lewis over the hurdles that he needed in terms of understanding who Jesus Christ was and being able to receive him.
It's interesting, as early as I think 1922, a friend of his, Leo Baker, had said to him, "Lewis, your chimney stack is going to turn into a church spire one of these days." So his friends could see as early as that he was moving possibly in a Christian direction, or back to a Christian position, because he had had a faith, and he'd abandoned it in his early teens. So his conversion was more like a reconversion than a strict turning from atheism, pure and simple, to Christianity.
His first 2 volumes of published work were volumes of poetry, and they were published under the pseudonym Clive Hamilton. The first 2 volumes indicate that Lewis was very much a person frustrated by his sense of not wanting to believe in a God, and yet blaming God for all of the pain and all of the sorrow in his own life and what he saw going on in society at that time.
God was working at him in ways which I think he didn't know. Why should Lewis be an exception? As brilliant as he was, he didn't know everything about himself. For example, I don't think Lewis was ever an atheist. Lewis believes he was an atheist. But if you look at Dahmer or Spirits in Bondage, and you read some of the poetry there, that's some of the most compelling religious poetry you'll ever read. Now, this is supposedly written by a man who's an atheist. There's this unknown self, which, in my view, the Holy Spirit was pulling out of Lewis, and he's writing this poetry. Warren Lewis said that he didn't believe his brother converted, that rather it was like a convalescence from a long mental illness, that coming back to Christianity was more along the lines of recovering his sanity.
It took at least 3 or 4 years, really, for him to turn about completely. He became, first of all, a believer in God, not a believer in Christ. He converted to theism in 1929. That's the famous passage which is quoted in a lot of his books about being brought in kicking and struggling into the kingdom of God.
And Lewis was struggling like a fish in a net, trying to get out, looking, as he said, every way for a chance of escape, because he knew that God would say, "You are now mine. You have to do what I tell you now."
Lewis wrote of his experience, "Amiable agnostics will talk cheerfully about man's search for God. To me, as I then was, they might as well have talked about the mouse's search for the cat. Remember, I had always wanted, above all things, not to be interfered with. I had wanted to call my soul my own. But the reality with which no treaty can be made was upon me. In the Trinity term of 1929, I gave in and admitted that God was God."
When he finally knelt, he said he was the most reluctant convert in all of England. And the wonderful thing is, he says, the divine humility that accepted him on those terms.
So it was another 2 years later that he became a Christian.
In September 1931, Jack's friends Hugo Dyson and J.R.R. Tolkien came to Magdalen College for dinner and conversation. Along Addison's Walk, they discussed metaphor and myth, then talked far into the night of how every pagan myth foreshadowed the reality revealed in Jesus Christ. Lewis began to think, as he said, "Here and here only in all time, the myth must have become fact, the word flesh, God man. This is not a religion, nor a philosophy, it is the summing up and actuality of them all." A week later, he decided.
That happened when he was being driven to Whipsnade Zoo one day in his brother's motorcycle sidecar. He set out for the zoo not believing that Jesus Christ is the Son of God. And when he reached the zoo, he said, "I did believe that Jesus Christ is the Son of God." Yet the journey had not been spent in any particular thought nor in any great emotion. The whole man had moved, he said. There was nothing of me left over or outside the act. I'd become awake, he said. I'd woken up.
Well, one commentator says that Lewis had nothing to say up until his conversion. Well, I don't fully agree with that, but there's a certain germ of truth in that. Up until that point, Lewis has been trying to be first of all, trying to be a poet, and he's floundering about with that. And then after his conversion, he writes The Pilgrim's Regress. And from then on, he doesn't look back. The works just continually flow from his pen.
It's not just enough to say that Lewis is a great thinker, or Lewis has got a mind that is awake. Lewis is someone whose mind was transformed by his conversion. So at all these aspects of his personality, which had been, as it were, going through on parallel lines up to then, really came together.
It seems to us that he went from being a formidable atheist to a formidable Christian right away, but he didn't. There really are about 10 years that we don't really know very much about. When Lewis was, in one way, God, I think, was preparing him. These are the 30s when he was just venturing gradually into Christianity. He wrote a few poems, but during that time, Lewis realized that he would never be a great poet. All the plans that he'd made for himself were coming to nothing. He might not ever do anything really worthwhile. And I think he reached the valley of humiliation that Bunyan wrote about, where you have to just give up everything and realize you don't really have anything to present before God. You know, you may be a tutor in an Oxford college, but so what? You're just a teacher still. You haven't really done anything. And I think he was brought down to the absolute bottom so you can say, God is my all, and mean it, and not think, God is my all, but I also have my books to my credit, and when I leave the college, everybody will know who I am. No, it wasn't that way. He had nothing except God.
Jesus said, "Whoever desires to save his life will lose it, but whoever loses his life for my sake will find it. For what profit is it to a man if he gains the whole world and loses his own soul?" Looking back on his journey to faith, C.S. Lewis said, "The hardness of God is kinder than the softness of men, and his compulsion is our liberation."